My number was 728716, and I learned that number more than I learned my name, my family, or my social security number, because that's what I was defined as, a number. That night when I got out of the car, May 15, 1994, I was walking home, and that was the longest walk I ever took in my life. It took 15 years to get home. The actual crime took place approximately 6 miles away from where I was actually walking at. I was taken not because I fit the description, but because I fit the demographics of an individual that killed one person and shot another person. I went to prison for 15 years for a crime that I did not commit. I was 19 years old. One of the first things that happens when you are incarcerated is you are immediately reduced from a human to a commodity. You are not a citizen anymore. I believe there is a purpose for what I went through. And with that on my mind, I strive every day to be held accountable to what God has for me. We met each other on Cofield Unit around 2005, 2006. I mean, we had a lot of long nights just talking about life and getting down. And I remember the night I left, I jumped up on the bed and I ran downstairs. I'm screaming out.
Everybody like, if I get out, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You don't know exactly what you're going to do because you make penitentiary plans in the penitentiary. But when you get out, those penitentiary plans don't apply. That's why they go back. You have to separate prison life from society. It's like two different realms.
How the system treats the individuals that are incarcerated, it's not conducive to transition into society. Everything that an average person knows how to do because they have been introduced to it, we're thrown into it. The internet, the bus routes, you can't get employment, you can't get an ID, you can't get back into school. You know before you walk out of prison that you have an X on your back. An identifiable mark that will limit your success in society. Even coming out as an innocent person, somebody's going to always lift an eyebrow. You beat the system. No, the system beat me physically. It beat me. We started Miles of Freedom not because I was wrongfully incarcerated, but because I was incarcerated. I tell people coming out of prison, I know you didn't have all the accesses because I was there. I know you're limited because I was there, but it doesn't limit you out here. You're out here now. That's an opportunity for us to show our change. When Van got out, we were able to assist him, and he's a foreman now at a warehouse. He's been working almost 4 years. Kenneth James, his biggest thing was going back to school. I just knew it was over. I knew I couldn't get a construction job or a welding job. I didn't know what I was going to do. But I want to thank you, Rich, for encouraging me that at 74 years old, there is still some worth in me. Yes, sir.
And I am glad I'm pursuing my dream. And what is that dream? It's to help somebody that's bound by addictions like I was.
Prison is not just a physical place. It can be a mental place. It can be a financial situation. It can be a relationship. We all have these miles of freedom that we must walk. One of the greatest things that came out of my incarceration was an in-depth spiritual awareness. When everything else that's tangible to you is stripped away from you, the core of your being is the strongest part about you. We are people capable of extraordinary things, no matter what we have been through. My name is Richard Miles, and my number was 728716.
But what that story is all about is Mr. Miles having a journey, and the journey started at 18, him going to prison for something he didn't do. That's what that story was all about. However, I met Mr. Miles about 5 years ago, and I volunteered just to come in to teach computers at Miles of Freedom, because we help people to come out of prison and get back on their feet. Mr. Miles started an excellent organization called Miles of Freedom. What we do there is help people to get back on their feet. Everybody have different needs. Everybody go through different things. But let me introduce my boss man, Mr. Richard Miles, and I'll tell you one before he comes up. We're located in Dallas at the Martin Luther King Center. We are open Monday through Friday. We help a lot of people out, about 400 people last year. We help them get back on their feet. We have interns, college kids that comes in and learn how to actually work with the public and work with the fear that people have. And I want to relate that to the same story probably Mr. Murray right here, Audie Murray. You think about going to the military. I'm a military person. There's a lot of fear going into the military. You feel good when you get out, but you don't know what you're going to face while you're in there. So we do know through adversity we all grow. So with that being said, let me introduce my boss man, Mr. Richard Miles. Yeah. Yeah.
How y'all doing today? I don't think I'm in there. Man, this is I just want to thank you guys for just coming out and being a part of this presentation. I want to thank Miss Lanning for this opportunity to just come out and talk about the story of Miles of Freedom. I'm married. My wife's name is Latoya Miles now, and her family is originally from Greenville, Texas, and so we frequent the freeway. I stay in Duncanville now, with 20 in Cedar Ridge, and so it's always an exciting time when we're able to come down to Greenville for family events. And I think last year I spoke at the Greenville Rotary, and it was at the post office. So I enjoyed that opportunity, and so each time I'm able to talk about where God has brought me from, because that's really in essence how I'm able to stand here today and be the work of Miles of Freedom. It's always a pleasure. And so my name is Richard Miles, and I'm the founder, president, and CEO of Miles of Freedom. And Mr. Henry Cephas, he's our office administrator, and I just appreciate him for riding down here with me and dealing with my driving. So I know it can be a task. So we just finished somewhat watching a short documentary, and if you want to look at it on your own leisure, you can most definitely Google Stand Together. So the project was done by Stand Together. Stand Together is a national group, and it focused on building infrastructures in nonprofits. And so Miles of Freedom was one of the 10 nonprofits that was selected to participate in this group. We went to Washington, D.C. Out of that, I eventually got a chance to take an 8-day trip to Israel, in which I was totally submersed in the culture. We landed in Tel Aviv, stayed in Tel Aviv for quite some time, ended up traveling the road that Jesus took to Damascus and Jerusalem. And so it was just, went to the Dead Sea, the Holy Wall. So just taking all of that in, it was a great experience. And this documentary came out of it. And so we kind of used that as a platform to talk about my particular situation. And for the basis of what I want to talk to you about today, a part of the Stand Together group, they introduced 2 words, and the 2 words is mental models. And what I want to talk to you today about is the mental models of incarceration. A mental model is basically an explanation of someone's thought process about how something works in the real world. Mental models represent the surrounding world's relationships between its various parts and a person's intuitive perception. So basically, we all have our ideas about what prison is and who prison is for, okay? But at the end of this discussion, I want to pose 2 challenges and potentially a 3rd challenge. The first challenge is every person in prison is not guilty. Now, we're talking about mental models, so I'm going to take you to a place. Thank you for the invitation. Sometimes I only get invited once, so I just got to lay it all out there on the line and run after the presentation is over with. But I think by virtue of my experience, and I believe because we are in a historical place and we can learn from history, then I think it's incumbent upon us to take history and learn from it today. What preconceived thoughts do we have about people, about today's society, that we're not really willing to challenge, okay? So the first thing is everyone in prison is not guilty. The second mental model is everyone coming home from prison needs assistance. So 2 easy things. The hardest one is probably the first when everyone in prison isn't guilty. So at the age of 19, I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. My dad was a disabled veteran, and my mom married him very early on in my years, and my dad found Jesus when I was probably about 4 years old. And I don't know if you know people that find Jesus and shove him down everybody else's throat, but this was my daddy. When he found Jesus, he made sure that we saw Jesus Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. And to get ready for Sunday, we stayed in church. And the only other thing that my dad emphasized more than church was education. And so if you know anything about Dallas, I went to Longfellow Academy, which is a pretty nice academy in North Dallas. I then was able to go to Skyline High School. I love Skyline High School. Skyline it was one of the hierarchies of education back then, and I got a chance to study all types of vocations. One of my best vocations was plastics engineering. I loved learning about plastics, and there are two types of plastics. There's a thermoset and there's a thermoplastic. A thermoset is a type of plastic that can be shaped one time. You apply the heat to it and you mold it, and you can only shape it one time, and it doesn't matter how much heat you apply to it, it is what it is. A thermoplastic can be shaped numerous times, and I find in life some of our choices are thermosets. Some of our mental models are thermosets. It doesn't matter how much I come to you and give you the truth, give you the reality, you're going to walk away with your own preconceived ideas, thoughts, and emotions, because that's what we are used to. Okay? And so I walked away, graduating from Skyline High School, getting ready to go to TSTC in Waco. TSTC in Waco is the plastics engineering school. I went there, took my test, and the guy that was over there instructing classes, he said, "You are ready for the next level of engineering." And I'm so excited. I'm telling my mom and my dad, and we're all basking in this opportunity. My mom was one of the first African Americans that was busted into Skyline when it became integrated. So it was kind of a real milestone that we made it to this point. And so I eventually ended up leaving home. I was working at McDonald's making $4.35 an hour. You know, I had it going on. You know, that was minimum wage. I made it from the fries to the hamburgers, and then I made it to the crew leader. So that meant I was on the cash register. So my whole objective is to stay at McDonald's, then graduate on to college. May 15, 1994, I was in Oak Cliff. And I stayed in North Dallas by Lovefield Airport. If you're familiar with Lovefield Airport, we drove from Oak Cliff, and I stayed on the corner of Crest Haven and Bluffview. And so my friend James, he drives me from Oak Cliff, and we stopped at a 7-Eleven on the corner of Inwood. And I bought me a pack of cigarettes back then. I'm trying to stop smoking now. I was telling Mr. Sievers about that earlier. Some habits are hard to break, but it's a challenge. But so I'm battling with this. And so anyway, we get to the stop, and Ernest was going over his girlfriend's house first, and his girlfriend stayed on the corner of University and Roper. So University and Roper comes before Crest Haven and Bluffview. And I paid Ernest $5. And I said, "Man, I can walk the rest of the way home. All it is walk up University to Lemon, walk in front of the Sewell Cadillacs. Bluffview curves out from Lemon, and I'm right there. The Red Coleman Liquor Store sits on the corner of Lovers Lane and Bluffview." So I'm bringing people back. And so I'm walking, and I get to the Red Coleman Liquor Store because it's about 1:30, 2 o'clock at night, you know, long travels. And I called my friend James, who I stayed with. I said, "James, I'm right here at the Red Coleman on Bluffview. I'm getting ready to cross the street and walk to the house." James cuts off the alarm because I didn't have a key. And as I crossed the street, I noticed a police car sitting right idle on the side of the road. Didn't think nothing of it. Walk in front of the police car. Next thing I noticed, I heard a helicopter and a light shine down on me. There are numerous police cars come from everywhere. And repeated commands, "Get on the ground, get on the ground." So I'm 19 years old, walking home, And all of a sudden, numerous police cars coming from everywhere. They handcuffed me, they read my Miranda rights, and they put me in this police car. And I'm telling the police officer, I said, sir, I said, my friend Ernest is right around the corner. He just dropped me off. I don't know what's going on, but you can go over there and you can ask him. The police officer said, everything's going to be all right. When you get downtown, you can talk to the detective, tell him where your friend is, and you should be leaving. The next thing I know, we stopped at a Red Coleman liquor store, which sits by Bachman Lake. I remember because we went behind the, not Red Coleman, it's the Texaco, excuse me. The Texaco that sits on Bachman Lake. We went behind the Texaco, and I remember getting out the police car, turning around and seeing the lake. But in front of me, I saw police cars, ambulances, and so forth. And to me, I'm wondering what's going on, what has went on. And I'm not even connecting my arrest to whatever is going on. So they got me in handcuffs, and they come up and put some stuff on my hands. Hindsight told me that what they put on my hands, they were testing me for gunshot residue, put me back in the police car, and took me to homicide. When I got to homicide, everything that I just told you guys, I told the detective. The only difference is I gave the detective the phone numbers. So I gave the detective Ernest Clark's phone number, who drove me from Robin Oaks to North Dallas. I gave him my girlfriend's phone number. That's who apartment I was over all day that day. I gave him Ernest Clark's mom's number, because that's where we left from that night. I gave him Carla Gaskell's number. That was Ernest's girlfriend, because she knew we was together. And I gave him James' number. James was the guy that I called, that I stayed with. I gave the police officer all of these phone numbers. He goes out, he stays gone for about 6 hours, and he comes back and he say, Richard, your story checked out. All of your witnesses said that you was with them. But we have a person that say they saw you kill one person and shoot another person, and you're going to be arraigned for murder and attempted murder. And so at the age of 19, I was arrested for murder and attempted murder, and I was given an arraignment of $350,000 bond. Now let's go back a little bit and remember I was on my way to college, and so I always thought that that next phone call that I would make to my mom and dad would be the conversation of, I'm getting ready to go to TSTC in Waco. But that next phone call that I made was, Mom, I'm locked up for murder and attempted murder, and I have no knowledge of who was even killed. Not even that an incident, I didn't even know an incident happened. I didn't even know who got killed. And it's interesting that a mother's intuition, or more so parents' intuitions, they know what their child will and won't do. And what my mom told me in that first initial phone call, I believe, was the encouragement that I held on through later on down the line. And what my mom said, she said, we know that you're innocent, and we're going to be with her for you. Out of anything that they could have done, those words was consolation to me. I would eventually meet my court-appointed attorney, because we didn't have the financial resources to have a free world lawyer. And my attorney brought and introduced the evidence to me. Now here's the evidence. It was 10 witnesses. 9 of them said I was not the shooter. The description of the shooter was 6'2", 6'4", real dark complected, had on a white shirt and shorts. I was 5'7", 5'8", light skinned, had on a white shirt and pants. The guy that was shot but lived testified that I did not look like the shooter. All of my alibis came to testify that I was with them. One of their best friends that saw him get killed testified that I didn't look like the shooter. They had one guy that said and pointed me out in trial and said, that's the person that did the shooting. The GSR test that they conducted on my hands, came back positive in the palm of my right hand, but negative anywhere else. My lawyer tried to dispute or raise the fact that I'm left-handed, but the only thing the juries heard was positive, and they heard the guy, the one witness, say he's the shooter. So with all of that evidence, or lack of evidence, whichever way you want to look at it, my trial lasted 6 days. The 6th day, it took 8 hours of deliberation. The jurors came back with a verdict of guilty. The courts held special court on a Saturday because it's not even open on Saturdays, and they gave me a total of 60 years in the Texas Department of Corrections for murder and attempted murder. A case that I had no knowledge of. So now I go to my first challenge, the mental model. Everybody in prison is not guilty. One of our biggest challenges as a society is the idea that our criminal justice system is perfect. When we blindly walk through life like that, that's in comparison to a family that's dealing with domestic violence and have identified these issues, but you show a feeling of empathy or apathy, excuse me, because it's not in my household. I don't really care of the indiscretions of the criminal justice system because it's not impacting my household. And so we have to understand that just because you view life from your reality doesn't make your reality truth. It only makes it comfortable to you. And for my family, growing up, keep in mind my dad's a disabled veteran, and I came up in an era when it was stranger danger, run from the strangers, the police is your friend. I came up in this era, so you got to understand my mom and dad's structure shifting when their son is now falsely in prison. What is the conversation now? What is the dialogue now? I have a 4-year-old daughter, and my daughter, we was eating dinner one day, and my daughter now asks me, because she watches these movies now, she said, "Daddy, why did you go to prison?" I said, "I didn't do nothing wrong," and it messes her up at a young age. And how do now I explain to my daughter, without her grafting any mental models negative about our police and authority, but being also aware that we can be placed in situations that are not always right. And so I grew up in prison. I went to the Cofield unit. Cofield unit is one of the biggest prisons in Texas. It houses over 5,000 men. It's in Tennessee Colony, Texas. Cofield is one of the 108 prisons, state prisons, that Texas has. Not federal, just state prisons. I met a guy named Benjamin Spencer on Cofield unit. Benjamin Spencer is innocent. You can look him up later on. He's been locked up over 30 years. Ben cut hair in the barbershop, and the common conversation when you get in the barbershop is, "Where are you from? How much time you got?" I said, "Man, my name is Richard, man." I said, "Man, I got 60 years for murder and I don't know nothing about it." Ben said, "Man, if you're here and you're innocent," he said, "I'm innocent too." He said, "Centurion Ministries is one of the best nonprofits that work on wrongful incarcerations. They're located in Princeton. I'll give you their address and you can write them." In 1997, I sat down and wrote Centurion Ministries. And they sent me a very generic letter back. And the letter stated that due to the overwhelming responses of actual innocence, the average person spends a minimum of 10 years in prison before we're able to start working on their case. That didn't discourage me because, remember, they just gave me 60 years. So if I got to spend at least 10, then that means I can still have an opportunity. See, hope is a great thing. Hope is better than nothing at all, because hope wants you to get something at the end of it all. And so here I am in prison, and Ben tells me that in order for you to get out, you need to begin to fight. And so I wrote my letter, got that letter back, not too much happened. Ben comes back and he said, "Well, you know what? Wait for your direct appeal." So the average person, when you go to trial, you lose your trial, you get a direct appeal. So we didn't have the resources for a free world attorney, so I had a court-appointed trial attorney, and I had a court-appointed appellate attorney, which led to a denial in both. So my appeals was denied. Then at that point, the person that's incarcerated must become an attorney themselves. And so this, yes ma'am.
What was your grounds for your appeal?
My grounds for appeal, and I brought it. So this, see, I know, because this is, and if you look right here, these are like the notes. So imagine if you never, ever opened up a law book in your life. And the understanding is, I need to get out. I need to win my freedom. Strickland versus Washington, Herrera versus Collins, Brady versus Maryland. These are case sightings that I had to then learn and digest. My grounds were first, ineffective assistance of counsel. And you had to take the Strickland versus Washington, the three-pronged test. There's a three-pronged test that you have to prove in order to validate that your attorney was ineffective. The other thing was Brady violations. So they threw away the hat that I wore, which was very critical to the description. So it was the destruction of exculpatory evidence. Sure. And so I had the Strickland claim, the Brady claim, and then the 9 witnesses that said I wasn't the shooter. They were all subpoenaed, but they were never called in to testify. And so those are my 3 points of error. But what was my downfall? The transcripts. My transcripts cost $3,000. I could not, my mom did not have the money for my transcripts. And if you file a brief with no evidence, the state will deny that brief for lack of evidence. And so my writ of habeas corpus 1107 was denied as well. They denied my writ of habeas corpus 1107 because we did not provide extra record evidence to substantiate my claims of actual innocence. It didn't say we were not innocent or we didn't provide valid claims. You just didn't provide the transcripts to substantiate everything that you're saying. And so with that, my mental model became prison is where I'm going to be. I felt like my wrongful incarceration was a thermoset. That it didn't matter what I applied to it. It didn't matter how much heat we put to it. This is my life for the rest of my life. I remember when I turned 30, I had been locked up 12 years. And there's a mindset that you fall into because, as Mr. Cephas said, and as I can probably understand through Mr. Murphy's life experience and any other person that was in war, if you do something over and over again, it automatically becomes nature. And I didn't know that I was becoming institutionalized. I remember one day I worked in the infirmary, and the infirmary was a good place to work because you got a chance to get away from the cell block. A lot of the officers on the cell block only come to work to enforce authority. The people in the infirmary and the mail rooms, they come as a supportive piece of employment, and so they interact with you differently than an officer that's on the cell block. And so I was able to engage with these nurses and these doctors, and I was able to talk about things that I didn't have the opportunity to talk about on the cell block. And so I'm there, and they will come in and say, "Good morning, Richard. Good morning, Mr. Miles." And my response was, "All right." And this has happened over, and they say, "All right, all right." And so one day, one of the ladies in the infirmary, she said, "Mr. Miles, we always say good morning to you. And your response is always, all right, all right. What does that mean?" And it was for the first time after 12 years, I said, man, I haven't said good morning since I've been in prison. See, things like that, we don't kind of acknowledge out here in society. I never woke up and looked at my cellie and said good morning because it was just another day. And what's good about today, if I'm incarcerated, innocent or guilty, I have no freedom. It's only punitive. It's not rehabilitative. So what's good about my condition? But she challenged me to look through my condition. And that's something that we as people have the capacity to do if we allow ourselves to look past our conditions. And the next day she came to work. She said, "Good morning, Richard. I looked past my wrongful incarceration. I looked past the bars. I looked past my innocence. And I saw a good morning. Because I had another opportunity today. Everybody in prison is not guilty." Times went on, and in 2007, never forget, I was on lockdown. I had been writing people from everywhere. Centurion Ministries had consistently wrote me. And all of a sudden, in 2007, we're on lockdown, and somebody comes and knocks on the cell. "Miles," I get up, "TDC number, 728716. They roll the door, push this big box in, and I get the box, and I'm looking through the box, and it's my transcripts. And I'm like, wow. And it was a letter from Centurion, and they was telling me that they was accepting my case. And the first thing that they had to do was buy my transcripts. And so I had never got my transcript before. 4 years prior, my dad had went to the police department, and he purchased my police records through a Freedom of Information Act. And that's the only thing that I used to do my writ of habeas corpus, but nothing of grave importance was in the police reports. So I'm reading my transcripts, and it was like reading a movie script. And I'm like, wow. But it was nothing really tangible that I felt I could walk away with. I opened up the police records. Now, when I got the police records, I began to flip through it, and I found this document in the police records. An unknown female called and stated that she possibly had some information about a shooting that occurred by Bachman Lake sometime last year. Between May and June. She stated that an ex-boyfriend of hers told her that he shot 2 black males at a Texaco near Bachman Lake, and that the police had arrested someone, but they had the wrong person. He also told her that he used a 9mm pistol that he still has. She said that he showed her the pistol, but she doesn't know where he is keeping it. I found an offense that occurred on 5/15/1994 at 3021 Bachman, where 2 black males were shot and killed. This caller is terrified of this suspect and was very hesitant to give me suspects' names because she states that the only person that have been told about this is herself and the suspect's cousin. This was my case. The interesting thing is they had this before I went to jury trial. I went to jury trial in August of 1995. They got this here in May of 1995. What's also interesting is the person that received the phone call went and did their homework because you heard they referenced to my case. He said, "I found an offense in May of 1994 that fits what she's saying." And she went on and gave him the names. She didn't stop right there. I didn't read the entire document. She gave him the name of the people that actually did the shooting. And this was in the police records. Why wasn't this handed over to my attorney? Or was it? Why wasn't it handed over to the prosecutor? Or was it? We don't know. But what I do know is I thank God that He is a preserver of the record. What we forget, God preserves. And He preserved this record for such a time as that. And when I read that, I jumped on my pen and paper and I wrote Centurion Ministries. I said, this is Brady. By then, I had my legal jargon all down. I am ready for a court. Call me Perry Mason. And so I get a letter back from Centurion, from Mr. Jan McCluskey, and he writes me back and he said, wow, this is Brady material. Centurion Ministries is the tortoise and not the herald. Great. I got an innocence organization that takes their time. They're meticulous. But I didn't know that being meticulous is what's needed in overcoming adversity, because they looked at everything. And so in January of 2008, I got my visit from Mr. Jim McCluskey, who is a graduate of Princeton University. He started Centurion Ministries because of a job that he had to do in seminary, where he went to visit some people in prison and met an innocent person in prison and stopped his ambitions of being a Presbyterian minister and started Centurion Ministries, which has freed over 50-something innocent people in prison. He came to visit me, my private investigator, and my attorney, and all of this was paid for through Centurion Ministries. Needless to say, 15 months after they came to see me, I walked out of prison. This was not the only piece of evidence that they unearthed in my case. There was other documents that gave them information of other people that was associated with this crime. This was never brought out in jury trial. Once I was released in October of 2009, Dallas had elected its first African-American district attorney, which was Mr. Craig Watkins. Mr. Craig Watkins put in the Conviction Integrity Unit, and the Conviction Integrity Unit was very important. It wasn't just important because it was releasing people that were innocent in prison, African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, it didn't matter. It was important because the Conviction Integrity Unit restored humanity. Anytime we as a society of people disregard humanity, what does that make us as a society of people? If we feel that it is humane to have people innocent in prison, then we need to really look at what we define as humanity. And so the Conviction Integrity Unit offered a balance of justice, because if you look up the Greek translation of justice, it also encompasses vindication. And that means that you have identified something is wrong and you went through the proper procedures of making it right, if we're going to look at justice as a whole. And so the Conviction Integrity Unit was established through Mike Ware, Terry Moore, and Jenna Parker. My Centurion Ministries brought my case to the Conviction Integrity Unit, and they took it a little higher. They went and talked to the witness, the guy that testified against me. And I always wondered why or how. He was the only witness behind the Texaco. All the other witnesses were in front of the Texaco. He was the only one behind the Texaco. He was the only one that saw me in handcuffs. And when they put them all in the car and took them to a photographic lineup, who was the person that's going to pick me out? The person that saw me in custody. Nobody else could pick me out because I never was there. And then the photographic lineup, I was the only person in the photographic lineup with a white t-shirt on. That's tainted identification. That's a one-on-one tainted identification coupled with a suggested photographic lineup. That's the first piece. And he then tells the prosecutors, signs an affidavit in 2010 stating that the prosecutor, Mr. Thomas D. Moore, open records, coerced him to walk in and testify against me. He told him the day of trial that he did not identify or recognize me as the shooter. Mr. Dillmore took my picture out of his pocket the day of trial and said, "This is Richard Miles. He's going to be sitting next to his attorney. When you walk in, I'm going to ask you, do you see the person that did the shooting? I want you to point him out." He pointed me out, and that sealed my conviction. Remember the GSR test? We couldn't afford any rebuttals or refutes to this GSR test. Centurion Ministries did. They hired a gunshot residue analyst to look at this report. It was negative. The Conviction Integrity Unit went to SWIFT, Southwest Institute for Forensic Science, and talked to the lady that testified so adamantly in 1994 and showed her now the results of this test. She signs an affidavit placed in the Dallas Morning News stating that if given an opportunity, she would not testify in the same manner because my hands were not dirty for handling or shooting a weapon. She talked about an FBI threshold level that was non-existent at that point in time. And so the gunshot residue test was falsified. The identification was coerced, coupled with all the other evidence that they never brought out in trial, led to the first non-DNA, no confession exoneration. My case is in the law books. So ex parte Richard Miles is in the Southwest Reporter 352nd edition. My case is the first case where a person has been proven actually innocent, where there is no DNA and no confession. They refer to my case as a Herlachian task because it is almost impossible to prove what God allowed to be preserved and proved. My final challenge to you guys is everybody coming out of prison needs assistance. And this is what is the birth of Miles of Freedom. I was speaking with Miss Susan earlier, and this is my therapy for me. I have an opportunity to go out and talk about what I've been through and share my dialogue and share my story, and it helps me. But for so many people coming home from prison that are actually guilty of the crimes that they may have been convicted of, or innocent, and if they're guilty, they never had this processing time. And so they come out of prison with no rehabilitative assistance. If you understand anything about the Texas prison system, we've had two great administrations. Okay? 150 years after the emancipation, I say Texas prisons went from punitive to prejudice. I gotta give you the truth. Because what do I mean? In Texas, we had one prison, Huntsville. We had one prisoner, which was a white gentleman that was locked up for stealing horses. After the emancipation was passed, the first African Americans that was incarcerated were all innocent. This is history. Because you got to learn you're captive. I was captive by the Texas prison system, so I studied it. Okay? So the first 15 African Americans were all innocent. In 1 year, the Texas prison system went from 1 to 261 after the Emancipation Proclamation. After. Okay? And so I'm bringing this out to add context to where we are right now, because it's very important. Why? Because the 13th Amendment allows the mentality and the system of slavery to be in the prison system. So what was that? Disassociation from family, lack of proper and medical assistance, lack of education, and think about what happens when a person is incarcerated now. Black, white, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. You are engulfed into this system that nobody is trying to challenge. The only two people that challenged it from an administrative level was Mr. Beto and Mr. Ellis. And we have units named after Beto and Ellis. Both of them were great men, and they introduced the vocational systems in the prison system, and they introduced the spiritual parts of the system, but because of the budget cuts, those things that were introduced from a rehabilitative standpoint were surely stripped away. And so we ended up with just housing and labor. And it's not conducive for when people return home from prison. And so Miles of Freedom is established to address those quality of life issues that present themselves as obstacles and barriers for people returning home from prison. It doesn't matter if you're innocent or guilty. We understand because you're coming from the prison system, you need help. It doesn't matter if you're white, black, Hispanic, or Korean. If you're coming from the prison system, you need help. I had been gone 15 years. I went to prison when I was 19. I got out when I was 34. Can you imagine? When I went to prison, beepers had just came out. When I got out, iPhones. mean, they gave me my beeper back in my property, but I couldn't use it. I mean, when I went to prison, there was no trains. When I got out, there's trains everywhere in Dallas. I'm used to the bus. But in order for me to move around, okay, take the green line to the red line to the orange line. What happened to the 15 Ramona singing hills? But imagine how overwhelming that experience is. Imagine our men and women that come from the armed services. You've been in an isolated area for an appointed time, and now you're back over here. But you got resources. Miles of Freedom wants to be the resource for families, individuals, and communities impacted by incarceration. And it's been because of this struggle that we are blessed to do that. So I just want to thank you guys for this opportunity to talk about the journey of Miles of Freedom. If you have any questions, I am more than open to listen and answer if I can. Yes, sir.
Well, I'd like to hear a little bit more about those 15 years.
Yes, sir.
Exactly. I mean, 'cause I think it's just warehousing.
Mm-hmm.
That people are just there.
Mm-hmm.
And so what opportunities were there for you? Because obviously you grew
Yes,
in
sir.
that experience. So tell us a little bit about that.
That's a good question. There are limited opportunities if you go to prison with an education. So in 2000, it used to be possible for a person to enroll in college once they get locked up. So for me, I graduated from high school, right? So the next level was college. And so when I got locked up, I was able to enroll in college. And so I enrolled in Trinity Valley Community College. I took AutoCAD Release 12, which was drafting, psychology, sociology. All of a sudden the budget cut comes and you had to have the money on your books in order to go to school. And who has $35,000? What family has $35,000 that you got to have that on your books in order to now? So college went away. The only other thing was work. The first job I had was in the fields. Field labor. True transparency. True transparency. I'm gonna come here again, but true transparency. When I got the invite, keep in mind I'm from prison, so we've had to pick a lot of things, and so I get the invite to the Audie Murphy Cotton Museum. I'm like, yeah, guys, you got a sense of humor there. and I toyed with the idea. I'm like, wow, what better place to present a history than a point of pain. And so my first job was in agriculture, and you work for free. And so on Cofield unit, Cofield or Tennessee Colony, Texas is big in agriculture. Sweet potatoes, blackberries, watermelons, all of that we planted and we produced it, we did everything. And you did it for free. The way you get out of the fields, you have to be a good worker or you have to sing. And so that's what I did. You know the movies. You got the lead row and the tail row. And you hear these chants and you got 1, 2, 3, and your 4 step. So we're doing that. We got to do that out there in order for the person to say, you're a good worker. Well, you can go now, work in the kitchen. Wow, thank you. And so these were the elevations. And so I went from working in the fields to working in the kitchen, and I was able to have favor amongst the officers because, we become family. You in a place for 10 years with a sergeant that's now a lieutenant and a captain, and y'all done looked after each other in this environment. So I grew, my jobs grew because of the favor that I was blessed to have. And so the education was there to a limited degree, but I evolved because of the job opportunities that I was able to be a part of. And not everybody has that opportunity to get out of the fields. I know people that's been in the fields for years and I just don't have that chance. So prison in itself, it is a very mentally draining place. It's nothing that pours back into the person from a mental aspect. And that's what's detrimental to them and society when they come out. Because if you're coming from a negative environment, for whatever reason, whether it's a governmental oversight or just your own negative influences, and then you're put in a negative environment, how in the heck do we think you're going to come out positive?
Are there books? Is there a library?
There is a, so Cofield, once again, is the biggest prison. Our library was still shabby with its books. You know, our law library was probably about the size of this space right here. And so to shepherdize cases and to really get into the nitty gritty of lawing, you're very limited. The other thing is you have to put in a request to go to the law library to get medical assistance. And so if you got 5,000 inmates sending a request to one doctor, the likelihood of you getting seen or going to read a book is very unlikely in the next 2 or 3 months. They may see you after the tooth is fell out or after somebody has sent you some books, but it's just hard to get services because it's so few resources that you can really tap into. And so what happens is the inmates begin to educate each other. But I can only learn so much from a guy that's been here for 25 years. I mean, it's always, you may be able to tell me how to survive in prison, but can you tell me how to thrive once I'm gone? And so that's what happens in prison. I learned how to survive. Shawshank Redemption, Morgan, and Andy. These were some of the best people, inmates you could ever meet. Just by their work. Look where they worked at. And he could not make parole. That's one of our challenges. We criticize people that come out of prison and say, you don't want to work. But you got to understand, in the Texas prisons, you never were paid to work. And so the core essence of work, meaning you work, you get paid, you get compensated, you're never taught that in prison. And if you didn't have a job before you went to prison, I don't want to work. There ain't nothing good about working because it's never been introduced to you. You have no value in your work ethics because nobody has ever given you value. I never knew my value of work, even though I worked every day in prison. I just knew I could work. You give me a task to do, I'm going to perform that task. Yes, ma'am.
Was Dallas and Cofield the only two locations you were ever put in?
Yes, ma'am. So when I left the Dallas prisons, you do go through a transit process. And so the first transit unit I went to was Gurney Unit, which is in Tennessee Colony, Texas. And Gurney holds you for like 2 years, and then they send you to diagnostics. Diagnostics is in Huntsville, and that's where they pretty much determine what permanent unit you'll be placed on. And so from diagnostics, I was sent to Cofield unit, which is a maximum security. So based upon my time, type of offense, and it wasn't really age because the average person on Gurney unit was probably like 35, 40, and I was 20 years old going on this. But that was a good thing. I would have rather went to an old convict unit than like Beto one where they were young, 18, 19, ain't no telling what. So it's God covered me and I didn't even know. But to your point, yes, ma'am, I was only on those 2 units. Yes, sir.
The beginning of your story rang to memory of a good friend of mine's father. Used to come to us and say over and over and over, nothing good happens after midnight.
Yeah.
And I think you can confirm it.
Yes. To your point, true. That's why my daughter has me in the house at 8 o'clock. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
After you were proven not guilty and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
is anybody going back and appraising the process that didn't do all of these things? Is anybody accountable for that?
So a couple of things has happened or transpired since my release, and not particularly just because of my case, but because there's been so many exonerations. And so you do have different procedures that take place when a person is arrested. So one of them is called the three blind sequential lineup, meaning when a person is arrested, when you go into this room, the person that shows you the lineup does not know who the suspect is. Nobody knows who the suspect is, so they won't point out or try to identify. So that protects the integrity of the conviction, which is important. So that's something that has been changed. When I was found not guilty, I did file with the State Board of Texas Brady violations because of the failure to disclose this exculpatory evidence. They found grounds of prosecutorial misconduct. The prosecutor had to get counsel, but it was nothing that was ever pushed forward because of that. And the other thing was right after my case, the Michael Morton case. So Michael Morton now is the Michael Morton Act. And so Michael Morton was a gentleman that was falsely imprisoned, and he is probably one of the only people where his prosecutor was actually, and he was actually a judge, but removed from bench or penalized for his oversight or lack of oversight in the Michael Morton's case. So there are some things that has taken place, but it's always a fight, to make it better or more transparent. Yes, ma'am. Did I answer your question?
Well, yes, there's just a lot of mistakes that a lot of people didn't quite do their job.
And that's, I think, if I can't leave with anything but that reality, because wrongful incarcerations are true, but we acknowledge that it can happen in many different areas. The arresting officers, making sure that when you arrest somebody that you secure the evidence. Don't be so rash to just lock them up. Make sure evidence is secured properly. The detective, acknowledge this person's alibis. I mean, good God, I didn't have time to go make up this story. You done called 6 people. Do you think all of them is, so acknowledge the obvious, the lawyers. So what I want to push for is, and this is what I believe happened. I believe after the police officers finished their investigation and it was passed on to the prosecutor, the phone call comes in months later. The prosecutor never went back to check to see if anything else was added to those original files. And so they went on not going back and saying, you know what, let's repull all these records. Because if they would have, I believe they would have saw this phone record. So one could say it was negligence. Another could say that it was, permanent,
I guess there's a message there that person that made the phone call and that bit of see something, say something.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that's a message that the least tiniest bit of information can be a world to
yes, ma'am.
else.
It is the world, and even with Marcus Thurman after 15 years, they say, aren't you mad at him for telling a lie? And no, I'm glad that he finally told the truth. You know what I'm saying? I can't get mad at the lie. I said this in church the other day. We sometimes get mad about the weights, but we don't appreciate the muscle that we gain because of the weight. We walk with these weights on us all day long, and when we finally realize that this is a weight, I take it off. I'm mad because I had the weight on, and you disregard the weight that's made you stronger because of that trial. You know, so I've learned in all things to be content. I've learned that.
That's great.
I had to take it on one time. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Your jury, do you remember the makeup of your jury?
Yes, ma'am. So I had a very diverse jury. I can't, you know, some people can blame it on racial divides or lack of thereof. Mine was very diverse. My jury foreman was a young African American lady that kept looking at me. I thought she liked me, but she was the one that said, "You guilty." So smiles are pretty aesthetic these days. I don't take a smile as if you just really like me. But to your point, no, ma'am. And also, when I do presentations, I also acknowledge the jurors as being part of the wrongful conviction because they heard the evidence. And that was one of my barriers in my writ of habeas corpus because the courts hold true to the jurors. They say if the jurors said it, we hold the jurors to be competent. And so when you're hearing this evidence and you hear reasonable doubt, you got to understand, man, follow it.
Yeah.
Follow reasonable doubt because the courts is going to hold you to this like high standard. So you got to really, really key in. That's important. Yes, sir.
Weren't looking at the ceiling, were they?
Right. Looking at, they sure wasn't looking at the evidence. Right. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, sir.
I just have one more question.
Yes, sir. No problem.
Because no doubt you were successful while you were in that 15 years in prison.
Mm-hmm.
You have a lot going. You're good on your feet.
God, thank you.
But you said, you used the word successful. You used the word. You were able to succeed and get the better job and the better job and the better job.
Mm-hmm.
My thought goes to those who can't and who don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to have seen those people around you. And what happens to these people, the ones who can't succeed
Right.
in the prison system?
Right. So, I mean, that's the thought of Miles of Freedom started while we were in prison. So it was started with myself and another guy, Mr. Audie Jones. Mr. Audie Jones passed last year. Mr. Jones was in his late 60s. And what we saw was the vicious cycle. We saw the cycle of people getting out and coming back in. We saw the cycle of men getting time and going to the infirmary. And instead of sitting with the psychiatrist, they're giving psychotropic drugs. And so we saw the system churning up people inside. And really the only thing that we could do was maintain our peace and be a light in that state. And we talked about getting out and going back in. And so that's what I do. I mean, I go back into the prisons. I try to be a hope or a light in those conditions. The only difference in my release and anybody else's release or my incarceration and anybody else, I had family. So my dad passed 6 months before I got out. He passed of cancer. So he never got a chance to see me on this side of the field. But he knew I was innocent. He fought for me. So I had my mom and my dad that was there for me. They financially supported me. My belief in God was more strengthened because of incarceration. I didn't run from my spiritual belief. I took that as a challenge to be more diverse in the scriptures, and I know that helped out a lot. And when I came out, you know, I had to humble myself. Men and women coming out, and we see it every day with the people that we serve. The humbleness is the key to success. You have to show and be humble to accept a job making $10 an hour, even though you know your value is $14, $15. Because of your education. You got to be humble to the fact to go live with your mom, even though you're 34 and 35. I had to do it. But it's certain things that require humility in and out that a lot of people, incarcerated or not, will never gravitate to. All right. Well, thank you, and Miss Lanning.
This video has been brought to you by Juice 34. Juice is your community-owned provider for electric, internet, cable TV, and true local programming.